Welcome to the third session of the conference. We are a little bit delayed, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. The third panel is about institutions and how we are treating photography in this framework. So we have already our dear colleague here, Sandra Križić Roban from Croatia, and I'm going to read a few lines from her CV. Sandra holds a PhD in art history, and she is a critic, curator, lecturer, and writer who focuses on contemporary art, history, and theory of photography, the post-war architecture, and politics of public space and cultural memory. Križić Roban authored a number of books, scientific articles, and book chapters published on photography, especially women's, cultural migration and conceptual photography, trauma, and alternative ways of memorialization. Sandra is a senior scientific advisor in tenure at the Institute of Art History in Zagreb, and as an associate professor of culture and memory at the Academy of Fine Arts, also in Zagreb, and of photography and visual culture at the Philosophical Faculty, OSIZEK. Sandra, the floor is yours. Many thanks for being here.
Thank you, Iro, and thank you, wonderful fast-forward women, to have me again. It is really a pleasure. Yeah, okay. So this presentation is a result of working with women photographers practice in Croatia, where, as well as everywhere else in former Yugoslavia, there are no specialized institutions dedicated to photography. Most museums have photography collections where photographs are often treated as secondary, mostly historical documentation. The only initiative to start a museum of photography in Zagreb took place 40 years ago, in 1986, when the Zagreb photographer, culture worker and promoter of photography Petar Dabac elaborated the idea in an article published in the journal Informatica Museologica. His efforts were finalized by the proposal of museum institution that should raise general awareness of the significance of photography, distinguishing artistic from commercial and propaganda photography, and which would depend on a level on education of the photographers themselves, museum experts and art historians. His article, unfortunately, did not have any resonance. My research of women photography is therefore limited, primarily due to the fact that the works are scattered, and for many we do not know where they are, while only a smaller part ended up in several museums. Direct contacts with artists who are still alive made it easier to navigate with part of the material, while data on those who worked in earlier periods are very rare and do not enable concrete conclusions to be drawn. During my research, I noticed that some women artists have initiated self-archiving processes, aware that this is the only way they can pass on relatively intact photographic material, which they take care of, to future generations. For my research, the reader, archives, and new modes of feminist research edited by Mariana Dewar was important, especially the chapter by Gina Ashton, Feminist Archiving, a Manifesto Continued, Skilling for Activism and Organizing. It proposes measures understood as processes of feminist archiving as a circular process of creating the society we need to be evidenced, which contributes to the skilling for activism and organizing. In the wake of certain views explained in that article, I will present 3 case studies which I believe illustrate the circumstances I encountered and open up important questions for which I do not have unambiguous answers. In the late 1970s, the now almost completely forgotten photographer Milica Borojević took photographs of the carnival celebration at an institution for people with mental disabilities near Zagreb, as we learned from the newspaper review. Only a few words have been preserved about this series, which, despite the diligent search, I have not been able to locate. While the artist's works and personal data allegedly stored with her colleague and partner are unavailable for research, underscoring the significant neglect when it comes to the photographic legacies of women in Croatia. From the serious C marks and late era, the only ones that I come across, we may conclude that Milica Borojević's style follows the path of new objectivity. But it remains atypical because her creative works revolves about the motifs, stone and water. Certain lines appear to outline wrinkles on the skin, simultaneously acting as traces of destruction. And while on the one hand we contemplate the metaphor of life unfolding even without human presence, on the other hand, these examples demonstrate the power of photography to direct our gaze to one element, transforming what we see into visual relationships, an artistic act of reshaping everyday materiality into symbolic relationships through the factors of light and time. Borojević participated in several exhibitions of a women's section of the Zagreb Photo Club, which started to be organized from 1973 onwards. In 1978, at the 6th group exhibition where the artist interpreted an illustration of a poem, her series on mentally ill patients in Loborgrad stood out, which was taken during a home carnival. This artist, who was trained in literature and cinematography, may have been familiar with the work of Diane Arbus from the early 70s, the famous series of the costume party taken at the home for people with Down syndrome. Croatian critic Mladen Hanslovski mentioned the grotesque appearance of the characters in Milica photographs, alluding to the influence of Croatian painter Krsto Hegedushić and group of artists from the first half of the 30s that called themselves Zemlja, the earth, which is a logical association in a national context. But we do not know how these images looks like. Despite her education, which distinguished her from many female artists of that time in the fields of photography and film, her personal archive remains hidden by the arbitrariness of her partner, who does not allow insight into what Milica took care of and self-archived from the 1980s until her death. Gina Ashton points to a particular methodological approach, the one she calls reimagined, I quote, a reuse and recycling of the archive material to create new archive forms, end of quote, while proposing new processes and archival structures. But the only structure that I can make in Milica Borojević's case relates to several boxes of preserved analog photographs. Some shots have reframing marks and handwritten notes about the number of photos in each box. Despite the need to actively contribute to the inclusion of this artist on the photographic map of Croatia and beyond, regardless the idea of the existence of female solidarity and cooperation and the application of practice as objective as possible, I do not find any perspective in this case. The question remains, what will happen to her legacy after her partner dies, and who will decide on it then, given that there are no clear instructions on how to handle Milica's legacy. Nadaore's practice is largely based on communication and activity in public space. As a mother of the child with developmental disabilities, she began to explore alternative forms of communication through art early on and applied this principle to the medium of photography. In the 1980s, in the shop window of the popular bookshop which operated in Zagreb, Oral set up a photograph of the back of female nude. It was an intervention realized as part of the proposal section of the then 15 Zagreb Salon, especially dedicated to the practice in the public space. Alongside the photographs, there was a survey question. Please give us your opinion on this piece, to which about 1,000 residents gave their answers in written form. The scarce remnants of this action were printed in an accompanying catalogue, as well as a small booklet on dark paper, which points to the lack of documentation. The motif was also printed on postcards. 3 years later, as part of the proposal section of the 18th Zagreb Salon, in collaboration with photographer Šime Strikoman, Nada Orel created a multimedia performance and projection entitled Experimental Image of the City, based on the questionnaire. These were large-scale projections depicting the messages, portraits of passers-by, the viewers, and the details of the work itself. Nada Orel is particularly noteworthy for the series of experimental photographic techniques. Often, she created them by means of camera-less photography, literally immersing herself in bath with photochemicals. She presented one series during the annual exhibition of Croatian Fine Arts Association held in 1991, displaying a series of life-size photograms on the facades of the building in Zagreb, stimulating the movement of the body climbing toward the top. For many years, we discussed her archive, while only recently I come across information that a large part of negatives and original analog prints ended up by one collector. In Croatia, he is well known as a person who approached old, forgotten, and often poor artists or their widowers, promising to compensate them financially in a proper way or take care of them. But the reality is different, and many of them got just small amount of money, while his methods are more similar to criminal milieu than art world. Even though Nada Orel is now in a really bad health condition, almost immobile and depending on care of her former husband, she sent me several of her large-scale photographs, which will end up in one museum. I still don't know which one. Besides, I started collecting and digitally archiving everything I could find, reviews, images from the press, and so on, knowing that works that she gave to this person won't be available for further research. The procedure I have taken consists of identification, documentation, contextual research, promotion, protection of original in my temporary position. I started to teach about her work, revitalizing the various aspects of her heritage. And this is a challenging process. Her specific practice, unique in Croatian context, especially production she made in or invent for a public space, stimulate further debate of these archival heritage-related activities. Current mode of recording and documenting is focused on experiences, oral history, and authentic, archived and digitized documentation, mostly reviews, catalogs, and other printed matter. In this case, maybe similar as in previous one, I consider my activities as a form of activism through which I respond to the actual challenges, as well as women's empowerment in the fields of heritage. Gender perception of Nada Orel's archive is still unrecognized, while her specific way of art practice, developed in relation with and often created for the people with disabilities, still needs to be researched and interpreted. Smilka Pavlović is one of the few women photojournalists who practice her refined documentary approach by covering a range of topics from the public life of the German province, as well as daily life of its inhabitants. Her photographs are based on the ability to find a balance between the subjective and objective gaze, where she used a series of details to clarify the wider context needed to understand the meaning of the image. Although a significant part of her task involved reporting on highly formal events, Pavlovich finds the means and time to capture subtle interpersonal relationships while trying to encompass the social community within which she operated as a whole. Her social sensitivity can be seen in numerous details, and Pavlovich never crossed the line of excessively invading someone's privacy. This is especially visible in her interest in old people, as well in the photographs from the scenes of accidents, where she strives to preserve the dignity of the victims and provide a general insight into the event without insisting of inappropriate details. Smilka Pavlovich has been continuously self-archiving her own photographic activities since high school and throughout her 40 years professional career, during which she kept a focus on her practice and carefully recorded data. She brought all the collected material to me in the plastic bags and boxes, and made available to create her photographic archive. Based on this, I held a workshop on self-archiving of photographic heritage with several younger colleagues, starting from the idea that for today's reception and contextualization of the works of women photographers, it is necessary to look back at the methodology of self-archiving, which many of them unconsciously applied during their lives. The workshop discussed self-archiving and self-organization as models for creating physical and digital feminist archives, applied to the materials collected by Smilka Pavlovich. During the workshop, special attention was paid to specific archival processes, while the participants discussed the interactions that arise in the process of creating archives. On that occasion, several methodological principles were discussed. For instance, interventions on existing archival material that needed to be presented in a creative and accessible way. Archive as a form of life, which means that we methodologically approach the archival material with contemporary political and activist context and not only following the historiographical archival standards. Reimagining the archive, meaning that the workshop participants raised the questions on how to access the existing archival material and even recycle some of its parts in order to create new forms, new processes, and archival structures that are subject to change. Documentation and collection of material is recognized as a starting point, and further procedures are based on selection, determination of material typology, facilitation of the procedure, and so on and so on. In addition, the participants discussed how and why to create an archive and for who is it intended for. Besides, we discussed its availability and where to store it after the work is done. We negotiated what is feminist in this procedure, mindful of including marginalized voices and experiences. The aim of the workshop was not to create something stable and passive. We dealt with something that has not been identified and recorded until now and which could be included in the cultural photographic heritage. We also recognized the value in the possibility of reconstructing the methods of education in photography that was carried out in the second half of the 60s at the School of Applied Arts in Zagreb. After we processed the physical material, two young colleagues, Ivana Završik and Leopold Drupnik, decided to continue and rearrange the documentation, photos, and everything else available in digital format. The different material resulted in a different archival experience, where the thematic barrier was set up by Pavlovich herself. Thus, both structure, digital and analog, were created almost in parallel, independently of each other. The self-awareness of the artist came to the fore several times. and she expressed it during conversation we held with her. By handing over extensive archival documentation that we freely had in our disposal, she actually enabled a presentation in which she self-archived herself and presented herself as a complete and authentic person, not just a reportage photographer who has been working in Germany for 40 years. Self-archiving and self-organization in the observed context depend on persons who have only basic knowledge in archiving and a lacking experience in these procedures. While the usual power structures which we associate with the creation of traditionally based archives in the new constellation depend on different systems of identification. This is exactly why these archiving models represent a challenge for researchers. What these three examples have in common are the procedures for imagining archival processes, especially when we do not have archival material in front of us to deal with, but also the interactions that arise through the process. The women I was talking about did not have a strong enough voice in making decisions about their own archives. Only Smilka Pavlović came with everything she collected over time, leaving us to decide on the identification and structure of her archive. This is why I consider this last example as a participatory archival practice which, in addition to staging an archive, gives voice to the artist at the same time propose alternative methods for reading the archive through the reorganization and reselection of material and knowledge. Thank you.